Are, and we're recording. Welcome folks here at the Art Fair Renewed series, the weekly series, talking to art fair artists. I'm Carolina Wheat, curator at Art Fair. And tonight, thank you so much for joining us. We have Travis LeRoy Southworth. Hello.
Hi, thank you, Carolina, for having me.
Absolutely. I love your backdrop. It's really looking good. I think some of these are familiar faces from also, they're on Art Fair, this series.
Yeah, I have a couple of these on Art Fair. I'm in my Jersey studio. I have like a shared space in Manhattan, but I do the bulk of my production here in my sort of basement. It's like nice and spacious. It makes it easy, you know, having like a little one upstairs. So you might hear some running around.
That's great. Yeah, you might hear some kittens running around, some other folks in my space as well. It looks pretty tricked out with those walls. It's a pretty fine looking basement.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, the one thing is like you're just not seeing everything else on that side of the computer. It's like this side looks nice over there. It's lots of wires hanging and a boiler and some other stuff. But yeah, it's sort of like halfway done.
Well, you know, at least you've got that nice big wall, because wall space is prime when you're working in two-dimensionality, and you know, you got people coming over and you just direct their attention to what's behind you, and really they have such a presence to them in back of you. It's kind of really a phenomenal backdrop for us to be talking today.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I chose it specifically. I thought it would like work really nicely as like a Zoom backdrop, sort of like these faces that are actually like, sort of almost menacingly sitting behind me and looking at the screen. I call them like my weird basement friends, even though the actual title is Familiar Faces.
Well, you know, it's kind of apropos, because the work behind you, while we know is on a wall, they feel almost like a digital backdrop that you've created as this grid. As I know, they are kind of, you know, digital manipulations, and you work predominantly in digital media, both for your day job and within your medium. And so it's kind of, it really gives to this real, unreal presence.
Yeah, I really try to push that in a lot of my work. I started out using like Photoshop in the early 90s, and was using it in my art practice in a number of ways. And I was like studying photography and like painting and drawing. And I was wanting to sort of like combine them in a way, like make paintings on the computer. And sometimes the works would exist only digitally. Sometimes they're printed out on more like a two-dimensional paper, or sometimes even on like silk, and they start to become like these three-dimensional forms. So I'm always trying to push that boundary between like, you know, something that looks two-dimensional or digitally created, but has this physical presence as well.
Sure. Yeah, that's really tricky when you've got, you know, you're working with just an image, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that image, you know, giving that dimensionality, it takes someone to practice a lot to be able to find that depth in the surface based work, which I do find in yours, and I'm always so intrigued. And I'm wondering, you know, we started this series during COVID and our quarantine, and we're, you know, it's over 60 at this point, almost every week. But I'm wondering, you know, a lot of the questions that we'll kind of get to is certainly about your practice, but seeing that you have a home studio, as well as your technology and technique allows you to be in the home. And I'm wondering, were you productive during COVID? And certainly we're still kicking, right? But
yeah,
I mean, were you productive during quarantine, or how did you feel even making?
Yeah, you know, like everyone is affected by it in a number of ways, which is the familiar faces behind me. That's actually how the body of work started. I've always worked on the computer in a number of environments, whether it's just me in the studio or in the home, or, you know, traveling. I've sort of, you know, ready for that in a way, but it did sort of take a turn where I'm like, okay, I think I need to start a different body of work from what I was doing, just because I was in a different, place, like physically, emotionally, and everything. And, also in the beginning, like March around 2020, like I had my son was like 4 at the time. So, it was like my wife and I were all home with him together and trying to work and yelling at each other and not being able to have, physical interaction. So I was thinking about a lot of those things in the beginning. One of the things I say about my work is, we live in a world where we end up touching screens more than the ones we love, and I feel like that has increased exponentially over the years, and especially so over COVID. So it's something I think about a lot, especially since I have my professional career as a photo retoucher, which
Right.
often bleeds into my practice and sort of like vice versa. So it's almost become like this one sort of ephemeral thing where I start to pull things from my retouching work that ends up into my artistic practice. Even if it's like a sketch of something, I'm like, oh, I see this, I like this sort of shape. I'm really interested in like the history of portraiture, so those really connect well. So the familiar faces, I live in sort of like a suburb of New Jersey now. I was in New York for about 9 years, and we moved out here in 2016. So you end up getting to know people a lot more in your neighborhood. And when COVID hit, it was almost like this really strange barrier between other people, because people who you were familiar with suddenly became strange in a way, either due to like wearing masks, people not being okay with being near one another, or the idea that the body and various things that come out of your mouth can now become potentially dangerous or deadly. So there's just so many different weird moments between people you knew or strangers, and it was just this sort of new way you had to interact with people. So
Absolutely.
just to speak a little bit about the familiar faces, I was working on when you're editing a photograph, you use a lot of digital masks to color, hide color, or you want to, burn something in. So sometimes when you look at those masks on like a black and white layer, it just shows these very stark differences. And I saw these sort of like nice, weird, soft, like an eye or like a face, but it was like this weird little thing. So I like those sort of sketches, and those sort of sketches became like the base for the drawings for familiar faces. So it's also thinking about like the relationship of like a digital mask versus like a physical mask, something that covers the body, a physical body versus a digital one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the masks themselves, I mean, were all of the works for familiar friends, were they all familiar faces, were they all black and white images that you're pulling from? Is that why they're all
No.
black and white, or you just chose to make them monochromatic?
Yeah, I chose to make these monochromatic. I just really wanted to deal with like tone, since my previous work, mostly dealt with color as a spatial feature. So I really wanted to sort of subtract all that and just see what I can deal with. And thinking about black and white, it's meant to be sort of two opposing forces, and I wanted to find like where's like the gray space between those, like where can you blur the dividing line in a way where you can't see it. So that's why a lot of the works are really soft, or if you look them up very closely, there's no edges, there's no actual like marks within them. They're sort of like, I use like really low opacity digital brushes to sort of just like slowly like paint in the tones in a way.
So unlike some of the earlier works, like the Retouching series, I know we're going to get to, and might be a good time to maybe pull up your screen and show some
Sure.
stuff. Like these works, when you're talking about opacity and you're talking about the masking and everything, those works that were behind you, you are going in and digitally manipulating them a little bit. They're not just like a true, I'm taking this and putting it here and then creating a kind of a composite of all of the things I removed, correct? So there is a hand in that beyond like a painted hand.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much majority of all my work now, it's almost like I'm collecting things on a daily basis that I may use later on, like the digital marks or little facial imperfections. They sort of become my materials that I then use to construct like, new portraits from. But they often don't even look like what they, the original abstraction was that I took from the source.
Which is kind of, it's influencing the work more than understood.
Yeah.
Then when you talk about these detouched series, which the story is so compelling, and I'm just hoping that you could share a little bit about what you feel, appropriate to sharing about how this body of work was fleshed out, pun intended, but how did you, kind of come to this practice out, I mean, kind of inside your retouching experience as a professional retoucher, but also what inspired you?
Yeah. Is the full screen working for the share?
Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah. I'll just talk a minute about the first piece here, and I'll see if I can play the video with the audio, because it's sort of like a nice segue into the practice. Okay. This work right here is actually a self-portrait from 2007. It's titled I Retouch Myself. And as a retoucher, became really interested in all these tiny things I was having to remove from people's faces, primarily for like fashion or beauty images. You're in a way almost removing all the tiny things that make us unique from one another, like the little moles or blemishes and like wrinkles. And I really wanted to see like, what would someone's face look like if I just erase the entire thing and only leave those tiny imperfections. And I also thought I should probably start with myself if I'm going to be, zooming in onto other people's faces and sort of delineating what is to be saved and what is not to be saved. I should do one of my own. So this work is called I Retouch Myself. And there's like a detail here so you can see some of the sort of facial imperfections. It's sort of like my eye, and there's like the tiny little hairs of like the eyebrow and my sort of mole. You can actually see it right there in the zoom. So I really sort of like how these pieces ended up being kind of like abstract, but they were from photographs. It was sort of like a photograph, but a drawing. And they sort of like referenced almost like this cosmic entity in a way. They almost seemed like an inverse of a star field. So I really like those connections. And everyone was really sort of curious about how I was doing this, like what was like my process. And I sort of wanted to create a pseudo Photoshop tutorial, and that ended up being, a video artwork in its own. So I'll see if I can play this video here. Let me know if you can hear the audio.
I will.
Can you hear it?
Nothing.
All right, how can I?
What you said the app you're using, which is this is the first time I've spoken to someone with this app. You said the app. I love the name. I actually love the name.
Oh yeah, I'm using this special app called. The name isn't great, but I really love it. It's called But I guess I haven't played a video yet with the audio. I also do have the video itself here. So maybe if I go back to how do I
maybe if you
do a new share and I go to the QuickTime player and I can share this, I think. So can you see that now?
Can see it.
Can you see the audio or hear the audio?
I don't hear any audio, and it's just it kind of starts with a low hum and a narrator, correct? I can't hear anything. When you stop sharing your screen, there's a little button on the lower left-hand corner that when you start sharing your screen, you have to click. Okay,
so I do screen share.
Yeah.
And then I can choose QuickTime and I hit share.
Share sound.
It doesn't give me an option to share sound, which is weird.
That is weird.
All right, well, I can sort of just cycle through it and talk about it. It sort of starts out as this almost like black monolith, but it ends up sort of slowly changing opacity, and it turns into this portrait of me when I was much younger. This is almost more than 13 years ago. And this is the same portrait that you just saw a minute ago, but it actually sort of starts to animate where it's actually showing something that's erasing the actual face here. And as I sort of scrub through it, the narration is sort of like a description of the birth of the universe. So I'm sort of like, you know, juxtaposing this possible new creation happening. And it sort of like zooms in, you can actually start to see potential, you know, flaws or imperfections of my own as they're sort of erased. Yeah. How's the quality on that on your end? You can kind of see what's happening?
You can definitely see what's happening.
Okay, good. Yeah, and as this sort of unknown force sort of dissolves my entire face, it sort of slowly ends up with that, you know, portrait. And within that, the individual sort of imperfections start to collide and form into their own sort of, you know, new force or galaxy or floating sort of entities here. Yeah, it's too bad I can't get the audio working, but it's sort of like a nice description of a piece. Let's see if I can go back to here and share. So some of these detached pieces, I started to give myself like more freedom, treating them more like drawings where I was moving around the individual sort of like imperfections or stray hairs. Sometimes, you know, I'd categorize them based on like color or shape. And I ended up doing a commission for the Drawing Center. They had an exhibition called Day Job, which it was looking at artists' day jobs and how it actually influenced their practice in a positive way, instead of, you know, thinking about, oh, artists, you know, they have to work too. So I really liked that. And the entire staff was gracious enough to allow me to photograph them. So I photographed all 16 members of the Drawing Center at the time. And I erased every single one of their faces and created a single portrait with all of their imperfections sort of overlaid one another. So it almost sort of created this one singular portrait, which you can actually really start to see these like multiple, you know, like eye wrinkles, like multiple blemishes, stray hairs and whatnot.
Yeah, it's so haunting. I mean, there's just like a ghost of a portrait. Right? Knowing the process really helps the viewer kind of become more attached to it, because those imperfections they just become, you know, otherworldly.
Yeah, and I'll just talk about like the sort of next series briefly, because it sort of segues into the other work that I have on Artfare. This series is called Figural Moments, and I really started to, you know, continually collect all these, you know, different imperfections, except these were all from, you know, the previous series, Detouch, was mainly photographs I took, where these are all from like fashion imagery. So you can see like a lot of like flesh or like backdrops, and I was just taking all the little things that I would normally sort of take out and collect them. So they sort of become these like weird sort of conglomerations, or almost like this, like sort of, this is a detail here. So you can kind of see, you know, all the sort of like little tones and colors.
And so these tones and colors, though, this is where you were true to that which you were removing. So it's like a one-to-one.
Yeah. These were like sort of like a one-to-one based on like location and actual photograph. So I wasn't, you know, changing the images yet, aside from just sort of deleting what was normally shown. Yeah, so some of these would be like composites of, you know, dozens, or, you know, maybe even like 100 images sometimes.
The layering really does assist with the density of those one-to-one moments. I like knowing that, you know, it's coming from a variety of imagery opposed to obviously just one, but I think that it was a really ingenious move to start layering those. I mean, the amount of, we always talk about time, how long did that take you, blah, blah. That's not what I'm asking, but just the understanding of that layering just exudes the understanding of your time that you spent already, you know. However, at first glance, not knowing those things, perhaps someone would think like, you know, it's like a Pollock, or, you know, doing some Joan Mitchell stuff, or kind of, you know, getting in there, getting your hands dirty. But I do appreciate the reference to photography and understanding that this is a digital print.
Yeah, and like there's sort of like a lot of like, you know, distance from the images when you see them in person, where, you know, from far away you're like, okay, yeah, I start to see like these little like colors, but some of them end up looking flat or look like they could be like paint or watercolor, and you get really close and you start to see like, oh, this is actually like a flat surface. Like these ones are like glossy prints, usually like mounted on Sintra. So you can really see like the details when you get close, and you start to see like, oh, this is actually maybe like, you know, some, you know, like photographic rendering abstracted from something.
Right. And I know, because I've seen your work in real life and know your practice a little bit, but we do have a question from T. Reckling. Do you see your work living more on printed materials or mostly on screens, intended for home or for work?
Yeah, you know, sort of both. I usually decide based on like the work or the series how it will end up living. Some pieces only exist digitally for a screen, and some pieces end up being like, this image is on silk because that's what makes sense for this work. So it, you know, conceptually it really depends on what body of work and also like what image, because sometimes within a series I'll have ones that exist on canvas and then another one that only exists digitally.
Okay.
Yeah, it's sort of like an interesting way to think about it as a conceptual artist and a digital artist, because, you know, if you're a painter, you sort of start from the opposite realm. You start with like a canvas and you paint. So you're not really thinking about the medium as you're working, or you don't think about it at the end, where I feel like a lot of digitally based artists, or even, you know, photographers, you know, and even in sometimes sculpture, you start constructing something and like the medium, you know, develops as you go as far as presentation at the end.
Right. Oh, well, I mean, and I know we don't need to dive into this right now, but I know that you're doing NFTs and working with Super Rare a little bit. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's funny because people like, some people are like, oh, like, so I see you doing Super Rare, and like when did you start that? And I'm like, I actually started it in 2018. I was like one of the first, you know, 3 or 4 artists on the site. I actually beta tested their platform for them.
Oh, incredible.
Yeah, people are like, what? And I'm like, oh yeah, it's like, you can ask me anything, I know a lot.
Well, I'll get Liz and you together to talk a little bit about some stuff, because
Oh yeah, definitely.
so interested. We get so like, do I care? Do I really want to do this? But as a digital artist, that, you know, predominantly yourself, that's working in the digital world, you know, we have the questions like, where does it live? I guess I can say that I haven't really seen any of those living moments of digital work of yours yet. I've only, well, I know you had the virtual show that we'll get to, but I've just always understood that your work was placed in an actual, you know, silk or canvas or something, digitally printed and otherwise.
Yeah, you know, and some of that is because of like limitations of you know, like exhibitions, and I do like when things sometimes exist physically, but again, it sometimes depends on like the image in the series. Yeah. So the other series that I have on Artfare is called Color Balance.
Oh, yeah.
So I was just these are starting to become much more painterly for me at this point, where, you know, before I was starting to move around imperfections or maybe altering placement, and now I'm full on sort of like, you know, playing with color, playing with masks, playing with the imperfections, but constructing, you know, actual compositions based on portraits. So usually each one of these you can, you know, start to see a figure or like a face, but I really wanted to sort of push that boundary of something that's like abstract but almost like representative, or there's like a figure and a ground sort of like floating, you know, like, so it starts to create this you know, like soft, ethereal, you know, almost like digital space, but I wanted like that question as well. Because sometimes when you look at the physical ones, you know, they're printed on like silk or, you know, like a fine sort of fabric that's almost like a paper, and they're like wrapped around a canvas. So they start to look like an actual watercolor. So I kind of like these questions of like medium in the physical pieces, especially.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you can definitely say the color balance series is doing that well, and the familiar faces series is doing that well because of the opacity. And this was, you know, the lead image for what we were going to do talking today. If you could go back one, Travis, I
Sure.
really love that work. You know, and then this really does serve as almost like a loose, very light watercolor on, say, like a vellum. I mean, it feels like it's not only the opacity of the ink or the gouache or the watercolor is so watered down, but it also feels like that translucency is on translucency. So this kind of meta feeling of this work really helps the work come alive to me. It's really stunning.
Yeah, for the ones I wanted to exist physically, the works themselves were, you know, so ghost-like and almost felt like they had this, you know, way or presence that you could actually reach through them. So I really wanted to push that, and so some of them were on like a raw canvas that's has like this nice, you know, translucent quality. So I actually kind of like, you can start to see the stretcher bars behind this one. It actually starts to form this diamond shape in a way if you look at it, especially in person. If you can walk around it a little bit, it starts to fluctuate, which is nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so these are some install shots from my solo show that was called I Am a Portrait. That was at Undercurrent Gallery in Brooklyn in 2020. So in the space, I have some of my more sculptural pieces that are printed on the silk. And it's really nice when, you know, these start to move and flow based on like a physical presence as someone walks around them. So they start to, you know, add like a nice effect to the physical works in relationship to the other pieces in the show. You know, so some works tend to be, you know, like more intimate, and I really like the smaller scale of pieces, and then it kind of like allows people to sort of like stand back and like go forward and sort of really sort of question the how the work was made, and, you know, like the materials and the image themselves.
And so then these, to go back to where you were doing the one-on-one series of detouching or the detached works, these are again with your hands. So you're feeling inspired from the detouching, yet you're kind of branching out a little bit more and using larger brushes and opacities in order to build something opposed to just layer and stack.
Yeah. Yeah, these like would be pretty much akin to like painting. It's like I'm, you know, taking a material and then manipulating it. So it's like the stuff that I collect is sort of like, you know, my little base collection. I'm like, oh, I'm going to pull this here, and I start to see something here, so I'm going to shape it here.
Okay. And then that which is hanging, you're putting in like silk or organza or whatnot, and then you're using wire.
Yeah.
The flow of it, certainly it's unavoidable when people walk around it, but, you know, just to kind of give it shape. I see that you're hanging.
Yeah, I wanted to create like a subtle shape, you know, whether it referenced, you know, almost like a ghost or some sort of like entity, or just as something for the silk itself to hang upon. It starts to become this like nice sort of like minimal structure that's part of the work. And I just really like the precarious nature of them, how you know, they could almost fall at any moment. And it also really allows people to walk closely to them and walk around them. And it's always nice to sort of like watch people sort of interact with them, because the silk is, it immediately sort of senses your presence and starts moving around just based on like that subtle amount of air, you know, developed from someone walking by it.
Yeah, is it David Hammonds that does some of this stuff like this? I'm trying to remember, but it's
Maybe. I know he's done a lot of like work on fabric,
and then hangs it.
like larger scale, and he hangs them. Yeah, like sometimes I hang these on the wall, but these two are meant to be like in these specific shapes on these wires.
And then one of the other things I wanted to address, and potentially it's just due to opacity as you're painting with these larger brushes, and yet your palette is pretty much sticking to this, you know, tints and pastels. Well, this one's a little bit more bold. I like the combination of the translucency with the softness of the pastels or the tints, working with your fabric. So I guess I was going to ask, like, are you interested in using more, you know, contrast or heavier values in the work? And here you have it.
Yeah, for the color balance, I really wanted to try to use that sort of like soft pastel color almost as a spatial feature, and to see what I could get away with. I almost like they have like this weird sort of seductive yet like garish quality in a way, because I feel like they're not common colors that are used, just due to like the level of saturation. And they sort of started that way because whenever you add or subtract color to, you know, a photograph, you like add red or you subtract green. So I was thinking about, like, you know, what would those sort of look like, just pure color, if I sort of just take my mask and add that, and then I just sort of, you know, was painting with those colors after that. I just really liked that nice softness to them, but the level of saturation seemed to work.
Oh, I understand. It's the process is just, it's so valuable to me to when you are switching saturation and manipulating color and just little dials, Photoshop, or like just even preview, or so, you know, like someone that's more of a novice when dealing with retouching or color changing and adding the sepia versus, you know, the red green balance and all that stuff. I appreciate this kind of that which is being removed, which is part of the work, right? And in relationship to that which you're using, you're not stealing, but you're taking. You're taking away, but you're using it.
I'm just borrowing it for a while. I'm borrowing all the things that have been discarded.
You're owning it.
Yeah, there's no trace.
No trace.
Yeah.
Where was this particular solo exhibition?
It was at the gallery called Undercurrent. It's in Dumbo.
Okay.
In Brooklyn. Yeah. And for this series especially, each work has a unique title, and they're all mostly culled from conversations that I had on one particular campaign, when people were using what I thought were not the most intellectual phrases to describe how to edit an image. So, you know, one piece is called "Not Very Pretty," or they would say like the strangest things about images of, you know, like even like women, and like one image would be like, "Where's your decency?" You know, like, why did you do this? So I have a piece called "Where's Your Decency?" This one, the silk green yellow piece, is one of my favorite titles. It's called "I'm Feeling Like the Yellow is Creeping Up in My Light Ends."
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so I can kind of sort of segue to the familiar faces for a bit. You know, the ones that were behind me, which you can kind of still see. And, you know, these ones, they're not based on specific people, so they're not portraits in a way, but they were sort of based on like interactions or moments I had with people. So most of them sort of started out as, you know, like me just using some brushes in Photoshop, and I'm like, oh, I kind of see like this eye, like a face. So almost like in a way starting from nothing, and like a traditional drawing would be, and I start to just like sketch someone out. But, you know, there's, you know, no more imperfections or no more masks of color. And since they, you know, started based on relationships of what was happening with COVID and the pandemic, they reminded me a way of like, you know, if like when you're reading a dystopian novel or seeing like a film, there's like that moment in the film where like there's this colorless haze and there's like a figure sort of disappearing in the distance, and someone's trying to, interact with them. And like for me, that it felt like that moment. So I really wanted to sort of create that sort of representation or space with these works. And it seemed like a nice series for me to sort of start and take a break from the color balance.
Right. And the paper that you're choosing to print these on, is it like a archival pigment print of sorts? Or okay.
Yeah, so these ones are archival pigment prints on a Honolulu photo rag. So it's like a very matte paper, which has like a nice presence to it. But I really like the flatness of these, where some of the color balance pieces, they have a little more of like a physical presence. For the ones that are sort of like they're subtly wrapped around canvas stretcher bars, so they come off the wall a little bit. But these ones, I just really liked how flat they were, with just they were either like hung on paper or they could be framed as well. But I just really sort of liked that in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so these ones are all just titled numbers, so it's like familiar faces number 5, familiar faces number 29. And I was really like wanting to play with scale, and I really liked how some pieces looked, it seemed like they were looking at one another.
Yeah.
So I usually, when I exhibit these ones, they're placed in a particular way next to one another. I like the sort of like the stark quality of the one on the left, and so it has like these glowing eyes and these skeleton hands, and almost like this weird sort of pointy but soft head or hat. And then the other one is just like this really zoomed in, close, like face that is like this weird character. So some of them, I wanted people to either almost see themselves in them or see someone else, but it wasn't based on any sort of specific person. So it's almost like thinking about the relationship of like characters and like what that means, and ideas of representation.
These, you have a couple of these on Artfare right now. So much. They're just so fantastic. And they're priced pretty reasonably. I mean, 800. I know some are a little bit more in the 2000s, yet still pretty reasonable for, someone that has a master's degree, been working on the same concept for 13, 14 years, has a showing record that you do. But I also am curious, do you price by size, or how are you pricing your work?
Yeah, sometimes it's priced by size, and it's also priced on, the level of work that I put into something, and usually like what sort of medium it ends up being on. Yeah. So, like since these are prints, it's like a little bit easier for me to like make, as far as production costs. And I usually like to have, different series to be available to like anyone. Like I even have like some older works for the small prints that anyone can buy, and sometimes I'll have larger pieces that are like more substantial. So
and if I remember correctly, you mostly do unique works, although you could print this in an edition, correct?
Yeah, that is true. That's something I should mention. Pretty much like each work, there's only like one. So it's like a unique painting in a way. So I call them one of one or unique work. I usually don't do editions. If I do, it's like an edition of 3, but that's the older work usually.
But they really have, such a visceral feeling, and the phenomenon of humans wanting to see faces and things. I mean, you're giving it straight at us, but but they have such a supernatural, spirited feeling to them, as well as, sometimes even the darkest one, that was a larger one that had kind of bar face with the white eyes, they still have that, they still carry the softness, and they don't feel as menacing to me as, say, this one's hands and eyes could probably keep me up at night. But I don't feel that they're maniacal in any way. I feel that they are playful faces, and they're embodied kind of figures that, you know, kind of emerging from that depth that you speak of in terms of the, you know, translucency and working with varying opacity with, I mean, this is when to the left even has kind of like a horizon line. So putting it in space and giving it a subtle volume really speaks to, you know, kind of the prowess that you're bringing to using these brushstrokes and everything. So just kudos to you. My question is like, how would you frame these? How would you tell your client to frame these? And what would be your ideal presentation?
Yeah, I mean, these can be framed as like a float mount, which I've done for my other series on paper. So, you know, it's just like sort of like tacked within the frame, but you can still see like the paper. There's no mat on it. So you would just do like a subtle white frame on these. I think that's like usually my preferred method for them. Yeah, that way you can still see like the presence of the paper, you know, even like in some of the install shots. I just like how, you know, you can still see like that little shadow, which I really like.
Would you ever think of mounting these on dye bond or anything to give it like an uber flat feel because of the malt paper, that matteness, and then you flatten it out on, say, a dye bond or some sort of aluminum? Have you ever thought about presenting it that way with like a hinge in the back or something, or like a cleat in the back?
Not for these. I just really like how the paper looks on a wall or like framed, and where it's not completely flat, because it just adds like this nice presence to them, where I feel when you do that, you know, kind of like with the Detouch series, that's how those are presented. You know, they're like mounted to like Sintra or something extremely flat with like a gloss surface, and it sort of adds this, you know, I don't know how you would say it, you know, almost like a scientific, clinical, slick feel to them, where the familiar faces, I wanted, you know, some softness to them, and that tends to get lost in that type of process, you know, where you're like, if you're printing on like a sharp edge and it's like jutted from the wall, you know, kind of like these, you know, that's pretty much how like these are, like, you know, conceptually each series is presented in the way that works the best for that work.
Sure thing.
And
well, I'm just happy that you're considering these things, because, you know, I see them in the back wall behind you, and I'm thinking of all sorts of ways to present them. And I certainly appreciate the quality of the paper as an object, and that by putting it on, you know, a mat behind, then it adds like John Chiara or someone that's like puts their work, and it still is like crumpled, but it's a photograph. You know, that photo paper it becomes an object, even if it's a surface, even if it's flat and has no wrinkles or creases.
No, it's true. And I feel like I still, this is like my favorite way to present these, because they feel more accessible when you walk up to like a matte piece of paper, like Hahnemuhle photo rag. It's like, it's inviting in a way, where the other ones, it just has like that, just too much of a clinical edge for, I think, these. And I think, you know, matte papers also, it has like this nice soft like warmth to them, which sort of like, I think helps them out being, you know, that way.
It does. And then, so, you know, these works you've been really focusing on COVID style, and it almost looks like two flames in the middle of a dark canvas.
Yeah, that was my favorite. I don't know if you can actually see, like, there's like some sort of like what looks like smoke sort of coming around the flames.
Yes.
So it's like it actually starts to frame a face within it. So I really like the push and pull of this series, how each work actually ends up having its own personality in a way, where some are like a bit, you know, more silly, and some might be, you know, more sinister, and like others, you know, tend to be almost topographical, or start to seem like these, you know, weird elements of bacteria, or you can see there's actually a little face within the eyes. Yeah, and I can sort of cycle too. I know we don't have too much time left. I did a virtual residency with a gallery. It was previously called Super Duchess, but they changed their name to Below Grand. So I did that residency earlier this year, and I was sort of, finishing up the body of work, Familiar Faces, during the residency, and we're talking about presentation and how, it's like, oh, we could do a show, but as I really like the idea of doing a virtual show for these, since they were made virtually in a way and dealt with COVID, and we're all Zooming and not physically interacting with people. So this sort of glass vitrine is a digital rendering of the actual space in Manhattan. It's one of those very small sort of shop galleries where the doors are glass, but the rest of it is not. So I sort of really like that container feel. So we rendered the rest of the gallery in glass. Mm-hmm. And the space is quite small physically. It's almost like the exact distance you're supposed to maintain from people as part of COVID, the 6 feet. So it's almost like a 6 foot square. So I really like that. So I collaborated with them and made this virtual exhibition, which was called Human Nature Perfectly. And even in the rendering, you can kind of see like the, possible moisture from this glass vitrine that was placed in the forest, which I also sort of liked how you can start to see like these also sort of like soft colors or tones coming through the actual glass. And for me, it actually looked quite realistic, and I really liked that because it sort of mimicked what I was trying to go for from the pieces. Like there's this sort of realism to them, but also this weird caricature nature as well.
As a logistics person, I'm like kind of like shivering and thinking about the water getting on them, but it's great.
Sometimes you just got to leave those precious, ideas behind. I know it's hard. I used to be an art handler for a long time ago, sure. So I've been through all that. So yeah, that's actually a detail of that last one there.
That's fantastic. How do you kind of control yourself from, I know most of these are named with numbers, 9, 8, 7, walking, seven faces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But how do you control yourself from like actually giving them names? Because they do have personalities and otherwise, how did you decide the naming convention or the numbering?
Yeah, I felt like the titles, like for each series, I have sort of like a title series, and sometimes within that there are specific ones. But I really like the numbers because then it forced the viewer to look more at the work and see what they might where it came from, or they might see someone in it or themselves, rather than reading the title and then making the connection. So I was wanting to sort of like play with that disconnect, and hopefully it would lead them somewhere, that I may not have thought of. Sure. Yeah, so that's why, and also that the reference of like, oh, like familiar faces, except I'm not saying how they're familiar. It's not like John or such and such or something else.
Or not like the Surveillance series where there's just clearly misogynistic viewpoints.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With the let's keep moving on since we try to get through a couple more pieces here. And I'm just really curious still. I want to close, since this is a virtual show, talk a little bit more about your NFT. Since you've been doing it for a long time, 3 years now, kind of pre it all blowing up. Like, what do you present, or what are you presenting, and has it been a value to you?
Yeah, I think it's been a value, and I think about it in the relationship of like digital culture and media, and how, we've been sort of slowly collecting these digital things, and it primarily started with, Apple and iPods, and you had digital music in the 90s, and people, felt comfortable with that. It's like I collected CDs and everything and all that stuff, and grew up with computers. So, I think there's a certain level of, individuals who have that shared digital history, through like video games or like movies, like the internet, memes, and all of those have sort of compiled. And, being a digital artist, even though I have very specific like conceptual series that exist physically, I also have a lot of works in which I'm like, oh, like this really should only exist on a screen. But previously it's very hard to sell work that way, because it's like, how do you make it scarce? It's like, yeah, I can make a painting and I can hand it to someone, and that's very hard to reproduce. But digitally, there wasn't the technology until recently. So for me, it was like, yes, that makes sense. Like, I knew about cryptocurrencies, and I'm like, oh, it'd be interesting to see if you could tie this digital image to a token in which it basically proves who is the owner. I think about the relationship of like, yeah, the Mona Lisa, everyone knows what the Mona Lisa looks like. There's Mona Lisa magnets and whatnot, but only one institution owns it and can prove it. So you can think about digital images the same way, even though they look the same. Yeah, you could save the image on your computer, but the person who has the token, they can prove that they own it. So
Sure.
for me, that was part of it. It's, easy, proven ownership. And there are, so many people, because like the history now, that people want to own these things in the way that people own digital music and movies and whatnot. So that's part of it. For me, one of the most amazing things about NFTs is artist royalties, which I don't want to talk too much about, but it's, in the United States, impossible to get like artist royalties from secondary sales.
Sure.
And yeah, and through contracts, digital contracts, smart contracts with tokens, it's immediate. So if I sell a piece for a certain amount and someone then sells that for so many $1,000s or more, I actually don't have to do anything. And that's really amazing for artists, especially digital artists, who up until recently didn't really have a great platform to like market their work or create a sustainable practice. So that's why I was really early into it. I've experimented a lot in a number of ways. So that's how I sort of found out about it. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I appreciate your take. I just wonder if whether it's just like another shell, for just like hiding money and otherwise, but it just also feels like an enormous strain on our environmental resources. And we don't need to go down the rabbit hole right now. It does, I just wonder how long or what it's, is it really here to stay? My brother is one of my best friends, and he's just like knocking me over the head like a whack-a-mole. Yes, it is. Stop saying,
It's definitely here to stay, and for a number of reasons. They're gonna, fix the environmental issue soon, but it's different. If you talk about Ethereum, which is the proof of work, that is, supposed to be solved potentially next year, but there are already other blockchains which have solved that, which have almost zero environmental impact. So that's like one thing. And I do think it's just the beginning, because I've sort of seen it. I started out when, there was no market, and we were just sort of like selling works to each other for, $50, $100. And it sort of exploded. And there's just a number of people who really love, like digital art. They grew up with it. They grew up with references in the way that, someone who grew up loving abstract painting or loving sculpture. So I feel like the majority of work that has been successful in the NFT space is digitally native. And the idea is circulating, it's not like someone's going to scan a painting and sell an NFT. I feel like that's not like, there's already a market for that type of work. Yeah, so I think, and of course, those things happen in the regular art world too, where, people hide money by buying expensive paintings and trying to flip them as well. I mean, it's, it happens everywhere.
Was it cash, wine, and jewels?
Yeah.
Oh, and apartments in New York.
Yeah. So
I know we've got about 8 or 9 more minutes, and I'm just wondering, you might have a few more slides, and I want to get through some of the rest of the work before we say goodbye.
Yeah, I mean, that's like pretty much it. I was just showing the sort of the virtual exhibition here of this series. I don't think I want to go into a new series because I'll definitely talk your ear off. So it's sort of nice to stop at these since we began at them.
Yeah.
And I can sort of come back to.
Come back.
There we go.
That's great. And you just, this may be a whole nother, can of worms, yet, thinking about facial recognition software, or thinking about GAN, or thinking about, even the harm that, I can't remember what it's called, but just like the face filters, like even on Zoom, I don't think I have mine turned on right now, but it's like one of those things where, working in technology, and certainly as someone that's retouching all the time, are you interested or researching or compelled to make any work that is about these ideas as well?
Oh yeah, I actually have another series that I actually use again to partly create the work. So like much of my practice in the different series deal with levels of like image manipulation, like self-perception and computerized labor. So aspects of each series is, may be automated in a way, whether I have a reference image, but each work is also manipulated so far by my, digital hand. So I was playing with GANS in a series that's called New Beginnings, Old Endings, Secrets Secreting. I can do like a quick screen share. I have them here.
Remind me what the acronym is. Generated Automatic Machine. What is the acronym for that again?
Oh, for GAN, it's a Generative Adversarial Network.
Adversarial.
Yeah, so those are, let's share here. Can you see the screen?
Oh yeah.
Of the install shot? Yeah. So, you can kind of see some similarities between like my color balance work and like the familiar faces. I guess this would be just between those two series.
Okay.
I was actually using, again, to create work in a way as a partial way of digital outsourcing, since it's something I'm very interested in. So I fed the network and machine my entire body of work of color balance, and trained it to make a new body of work or attempt to make new pieces for me. Because I was interested, I'm like, oh, like what would again make a painting of if it used my work as a source. And like the images I found were interesting, but it wasn't quite what I was going for. So I actually started to kind of like my normal process. I continued to use that as a reference or a base, and then I paint on them further digitally. So that's how this series sort of started. So kind of like the familiar faces, these are just flat prints on like Honolulu photo rag. These actually look quite nicely as a float mount frame, but sometimes in my studio, I just like to pin them to the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah, so again, like sometimes some of these do exist only digitally, and other times they exist as like prints. And they're kind of like similar sizes to the familiar faces. Some are quite intimate. I think like this one is like 10 by 14 inches, and other pieces end up being larger. So you can kind of start to see, it still has some similar colors to the color balance, like the pastels. But I'm like working on them much more. Oops, like that one's called Gazed. So I'm thinking about like the relationship of, what does like a computer see, a GAN see within a portrait? Like what does it mean to like gaze at something? So it's like this, sometimes the figures you don't really know like where they're from, like it, might be like a feminine figure, but I also really like these hands that start to form like these tentacles or almost become like these Medusa-like snakes.
Yeah. And there's a little bit of a conversation that's happening with these works, and a few others with Aaron Johnson's paintings. I don't know if you know.
Oh yeah, I know his work. Yeah.
And also, well, Dana Robinson, she's doing those pulls on silk. They have that feeling as well. Obviously, her work is far more, manual and in terms of like using paint on silk and moving it around with it's a really nice conversation that's happening with the ethereal and in the portraiture. certainly the otherworldly and supernatural. So I really appreciate that. And it is 7 p.m. 1900.
Oh, wow. That was fast.
What to say? It goes by fast. Certainly someone that knows how to speak to their work. And I know that there's so much more that we could get into in relationship to your really dedicated practice, but also just multiplyingly powerful concept. So intriguing. And I'm really glad we got
so much
time to talk finally on the Zooms. And I don't know, I'm just really thankful for you being on Art Fair, and keep it up. And hopefully we can get some of these beautiful familiar faces in the homes of other people.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you so much, Carolina, for having me. This has been a great conversation. I always love talking with you about art and life and everything. So it's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone that joined. We're on again next week, and I'll try to keep it up for a little while longer. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. And thanks again, Travis. And we'll peace out now.
All right. Thank you. Bye.